Good afternoon. My name is Enid Slack, and I'm the director of the Institute on Municipal Finance and Governance at the School of Cities at the University of Toronto. On behalf of the board and staff at IMFG, I'm really delighted to welcome you to today's panel discussion on stronger mayors, what difference will they make? Today's event is hybrid. That means I have in my notes, we have a small audience here, but we actually have quite a good size audience here. And we have at least a couple hundred online at the same time. So I would like to also welcome everybody who is online. Before we begin, I wish to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I would like to thank the external funders of the Institute, Havana Capital, Maytree, the Neptus Foundation, the City of Toronto, the region of Halton, and the region of York. I also have a few thank yous from our team here. I would like to thank Cass Foreman, who is our new manager of programs and research here at IMFG. I hope you have a chance to meet him. I'd like to thank Piali Roy, who's our administrative and communications assistant at IMFG. She's in the front. And of course, the Monk School people who always help us out, Adam Bell and Daria Dumbadzi, but also the people sitting here at the front who are helping to run the event smoothly today. If you are tweeting about this event, our hashtag is IMFG Talks, and our Twitter handle is @IMFG Toronto. Well, we are now about a week away, a little less than a week away from municipal elections in Ontario. The provincial government recently announced that it will grant the newly elected mayors of Ottawa and Toronto more powers, more control over the city's budget, the ability to hire and fire senior staff and reorganize administrative divisions, and the power to veto council-approved bylaws under certain circumstances. The province has also established provincial priorities that the mayor is empowered to pursue. So what does all that mean? Will it make any difference? Well, we've put together a panel for you today to answer these and other questions around what the strong mayor's legislation will actually mean. Our moderator this afternoon is Zach Taylor. Zach will introduce the panel and tell you how the panel discussion is going to work and how you can ask questions at the end of the session, either here in person or online. Zach is an associate professor of political science at Western University in London. He teaches and does research on comparative urban political economy, urban policy and governance, and local public administration. His bio is on our website, so I'm not going to go through all his many publications, but let me just add that Zach is an IMFG fellow and a big contributor to IMFG publications and events. Zach will be writing an IMFG forum paper based on this panel discussion today that will be available in the coming weeks. So you don't even have to take notes today. So I'm delighted that Zach is moderating, and I am going to turn the proceedings over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Enid, and it's great to see you all here. This is still coming out of the COVID mindset. It's amazing to be in a room with people in it, and it's sort of disquieting in a way, but also very welcome. We are going to follow our presentations with a Q&A session. We'll, of course, have Q&A from the audience, but we'll have a bit of moderated discussion with our panelists as well that I'll be leading. Could you bring up the next slide, or do I have control over that? It's white. All right, what do I do here? Yes. So, 6 years ago, after his defeat in the 2014 mayoral election, Doug Ford wrote these words that you see on the screen here. in his book, Ford Nation, Two Brothers, One Vision. If I ever get to the provincial level of politics, he wrote, municipal affairs is the first thing I would want to change. I think mayors across this province deserve stronger powers. One person in charge with veto power, similar to the strong mayoral systems in New York and Chicago and LA. I would want our mayors to have strong powers, but to be held accountable. If the voters don't like the job he or she is doing, they can fire that mayor in 4 years. That's how it should work. Now, of course, Doug Ford is Premier of Ontario, and his government has passed a law and accompanying regulations that, for the cities of Toronto and Ottawa anyway, changes the mayor's prerogatives in potentially important ways. And if deemed a success, he says it'll be rolled out to cities across the province. So our goal today is to provide an academic perspective on this change. I know that there have been other panel presentations recently in Toronto that have explored it from other angles. We've invited 4 experts to comment on specific aspects. So I'm going to introduce our panelists now. First, we're very pleased to have Karen Chappell with us. Little wave. There she is. Okay, Karen is director of the School of Cities and professor in the Department of Geography and Planning here at the University of Toronto. She's professor emerita of City and Regional Planning at the University of California, Berkeley, where she served as department chair and held the Carmel P. Friesen Chair in Urban Studies. She draws on many years of academic and professional engagement with urban governance and planning issues in the United States, and she'll discuss the American strong mayor experience and how Ontario's strong mayor system stacks up in comparison. We're also pleased to have Matt Elliott with us. Matt is well known as Toronto's chief Kremlinologist, having covered Toronto City Hall for 12 years, offering readers insight, analysis, and lots of charts. Starting as a blogger, he now contributes a weekly column to the Toronto Star and publishes the award-winning City Hall Watcher newsletter. He also teaches journalism at Humber College. Matt will discuss what effect a stronger mayor may have on the relationship between the mayor and the council. Alison Smith, at the end there, is assistant professor of political science here at University of Toronto, and her teaching and research interests relate to Canadian politics and public policy, including complex policymaking, homelessness governance, and the history of housing policy in Canada. And she'll talk about the impact of the mayor's new powers on intergovernmental relations and local autonomy, maybe also about housing as well. And finally, we're pleased to my right here to welcome Gabriel Edelman with us. Gabe teaches at the University of Toronto's Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, where he serves as director of the Urban Policy Lab. He also has a joint appointment at the Institute for Management and Innovation. And Gabe's published widely on urban governance and intergovernmental relations in Canada and across North America, and is a co-editor of IMFG's Who Does What research series. In 2016, Gabe co-led the City Hall Task Force, which proposed changes to the mayor's powers. He'll discuss how a strong mayor may change the relationship between elected officials and the city's professional administrators. So before we hear from our panel, I think we should first briefly review what is actually in the law in black and white and in the regulations as well. So there are really 3 major components to this. The first is that the province gives itself the ability to define provincial priorities by order in council. The 2 priorities that have been defined so far in regulation have to do with accelerating housing production and the infrastructure to support it. These are both generally worded provincial priorities, and I think that's something that we're going to touch on. How does its generality maybe enable different interpretations of what those mean? The second aspect of this is the transfer to the mayor of several powers previously exercised by the council as a whole regarding the administration. So these include the power to appoint the city manager, to hire and fire senior managers and the chairs of agencies, boards, and commissions, and to reorganize the city's administrative structure, which is organized into functional divisions. The third aspect is the granting of new prerogatives to the mayor. The mayor still sits as a member of council and votes on bylaws as before, but will now have the ability to create and dissolve council committees and unilaterally put items related to the provincial priorities on the council's agenda. The mayor will also be able to veto bylaws adopted by the council, but only if they affect provincial priorities or the budget. The veto may be overridden by a 2/3 vote of council. And finally, the mayor is now charged with initiating the budget process, which previously was presented to council by the city manager. So clearly these changes are a departure from tradition, but the question before us is, what effect will they have on the governance of Toronto and other Ontario cities in the future? And we're going to turn now to our panel to explore these questions. So Karen, take it away.
Thanks so much, Zach and Enid, for the invitation. So what I want to start off with here is what the scholarly research tells us from the international perspective. So the good news is that there's a rich body of research comparing council manager, that's what kind of we would call weak mayor systems, and mayor council or strong mayor governments. It's largely from the United States, though. In the UK, the national government is all powerful and the elected mayors are rare. Moreover, most of the studies are 20 or 30 years old. And that said, there are a few interesting insights that can inform our conversation today. So I'll touch on three. The first is kind of overall trends in weak mayor or council manager versus mayor council, strong mayor systems, the effectiveness of different systems, and partisanship. So in terms of trends, in the US, the council manager form of government predominates in small cities, population up to 250,000. 2/3 of cities with population above 500,000 use the strong mayor system. But cities seem to be moving away from the strong mayor system. 56% of US municipalities had a strong mayor in 1984, but by 2008, just 44% had a strong mayor. So if Canada is going in this direction, it's going in a different direction from the US, which is kind of true to form, a few years behind the US trends. So in terms of effectiveness, it's not clear exactly why the strong mayor is going out of style in the US, but it may have something to do with the effectiveness of the council manager system. And that's supported by the data. So here's the ways in which council manager systems are more effective. First of all, they reduce corporate influence. The influence of corporate lobbyists goes down. In strong mayor cities, developers and wealthy property owners have been shown to have more influence over land use policy. Second, the quality of public service is higher in these council manager systems. There's greater focus on implementation instead of symbolic agreements on climate action and other issues. There's also more engagement of local residents. And third, the council manager system reduces conflict among officials. So councilors are accountable to each other rather than to the mayor. So they negotiate more effectively, more constructively. There's more autonomy and independence for department heads. So they not only tend to innovate more, but they spend more time on the basic functions of government. So we can always point to the successful examples of strong mayors in the US. My personal favorites are Bloomberg in New York and Newsom in San Francisco, who were able to set and execute agendas from sustainability to same-sex marriage. But these are the exceptions rather than the rule. Third, on the topic of partisanship. Now, there's more partisanship in cities with a strong mayor government. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? So partisanship and the strong mayor form of government does seem to increase voter turnout. But partisanship also has an impact on the types of policies pursued by the city. There's some recent work on this out of the Harvard Kennedy School showing that if you have a Democrat as mayor, you have more multifamily housing production, regardless of the type of government. There's a suggestion that these effects are occurring in cities where councils have less power over land use changes. And this is more or less consistent with accounts of pro-growth regimes in the US, where developers seem to get a lot built in certain cities. But partisanship gets complicated in the Canadian municipal context. Even if the parties are not out front, one can foresee an outcome here where a pro-development ideology can take hold more easily as the mayor enacts the provincial priorities around housing and infrastructure. As we see partisanship take hold, even if it's by implication, as in Canada, we often see corruption. This is certainly what we saw in the Chicago of Richard Daley, and we're hearing about it now in just this week in the New York of Eric Adams, who's apparently micromanaging the city departments for the benefit of his cronies. So this may not be what we want to aspire to. So finally, I just want to wrap up on this issue of provincial priorities and the relationship between the mayor and the premier, the city and the province. What we're about to see in Toronto and Ontario is completely antithetical to the strong mayor tradition in the US. Home rule is all powerful in the US, and no mayor would want to answer to the governor. Now, again, there are exceptions that have worked really well in the US. I think again of Daley, who had considerable influence in the Illinois state legislature, and more recently in San Francisco, where the affordable housing crisis and the relationships between Democratic mayors and California Democratic governors have led to a series of pro-housing legislation with a strong affordability component. But in general, in the US, the state serves the city, not the other way around. There's no real US precedent for what's going on in Ontario. So for that, I'll turn it over to Matt.
Thanks, Karen. Yeah.
There we go. Yeah, I want to build on those comments because I think that was super interesting, but really narrowly focus in on the part of this that I think has made the most headlines in the media, which is the veto part. Everybody wants to talk about the veto. What is the veto going to mean for council? And I understand why. I mean, people hear about the idea of a veto and it strikes a tone of maybe being anti-democratic. Why are we voting to elect councilors next week if the mayor will theoretically be able to overrule those councilors? But, as somebody who has spent a lot of hours watching council meetings, don't add them up, please. I can't, I look at what the experience would be over the last number of years if the mayor had a veto, and I don't think it would have had a major impact on the function of council. And to explain why, I want you to think about the number 98%, because if you're not familiar with my work, I do a lot of stuff with very nerdy spreadsheets. And one of those nerdy spreadsheets is the council scorecard, where I keep track of the results of major council votes. I keep track of how often councilors are voting with the mayor, and I keep track of the mayor's win-loss record. So how many votes that are significant is the mayor winning or losing? And over the last 4 years, John Tory has managed to put together an overall win-loss record of 98%. Some years, as you can see in the chart above, it's been 100% in 2020, the pandemic year, and recently in 2022, which was a shorter council year because of the cutoff to do the election. But either way, we are talking about a perfect year, basically, for the mayor. So I think, the idea of a veto sort of presupposes a relationship between the mayor and council where there's like this frustrated mayor who keeps getting thwarted at every turn by councilors who are voting in ways that the mayor is not happy with. And under John Tory, that has not been the case. But of course, we need to consider the ramifications of the veto in, the context of, the current mayor and the person who might be after Monday mayor for another 4 years versus, what we saw pre-John Tory, and that would be the mayoralty of Rob Ford, and also the potential for the future for another, I'll call it wild card mayor situation, which could go any which way. But even that, I don't think the impact of the veto would be profound. If you look at the chart again, you can see that when Rob Ford was elected, as tends to be the convention, council still gave him a pretty wide latitude to pursue his mandate. There were pretty overwhelming votes to do things that Rob Ford had campaigned on, like make the TTC an essential service, get rid of the vehicle registration tax. And I expect that convention would hold with a different mayor. You would not immediately see council go all out. We're going to oppose the mayor on everything. That could happen, as did happen with Rob Ford, but that requires, a negative relationship between the mayor and council to develop over time. It's not going to be an automatic or a default. And there's also another slide that I think is interesting after this one that Zach put together, looking at the way that council has become more lopsided toward the mayor over time. So if you look at the Lastman and Miller years, it's more, the results of votes was more even. But starting with the Ford years, continuing on to the Tory years, there's a situation where most votes see, 90+% of councillors on the side of the mayor. So we are not seeing these really close to even splits where 1 or 2 votes would shift an issue one way or the other. So, this is what the data tells us and how a veto, could work publicly. I also think, though, it's important to think about how a veto might play out behind the scenes. The threat of a veto could have implications for how the mayor and councillors interact with one another. You could imagine a situation where, if a councillor isn't willing to back the mayor on a certain thing, the mayor could say, well, we got a vote coming up on something to do with your ward, and it would be a real shame if, I were to veto it. Which could happen, but even that, the thing about this is the veto power has been so far limited towards provincial priorities, which I think is a very odd twist in this whole saga. But you also end up with this situation where the mayor is still going to need a majority of council on side to proactively pass new bylaws. So there's still going to be a need for the mayor to build council relationships, and those relationships will not be strong relationships if the mayor is going around talking a bit like a mob boss and saying, I'm going to veto stuff if you don't back me. So I still think under this system, the relationship between the mayor and council will be important. The key job of the mayor will be to build consensus and to be the person who is trying to marshal a majority of support wherever possible, because it's not, something that you want to see, having to threaten the veto or use the veto a lot. But at the same time, when I do look at this bill as what will have the greatest implications, I look past the veto and I look to the budget stuff, which I think we'll talk a lot about as part of this session. So veto is interesting, but there's other stuff in this bill that I think will have way more an impact on the day-to-day. Thank you.
Allison.
Great, thank you. It's nice to be here today. Thank you again to Zach and to Enid for organizing this. There's 2 points that I wanted to make about the strong mayor powers. The first relates to intergovernmental relations and local autonomy, and the second is the provincial priority aspect and specifically housing. So in the 1970s, University of Toronto political scientist Richard Simeon wrote an important book on federalism called Federal Provincial Diplomacy. And he argued that policymaking in Canada takes place in a process of bargaining between executives, between the federal and provincial government. And he refers to that process as diplomacy. He shows how pensions, education, and constitutional review have been shaped by this type of diplomatic policymaking relationship. The downside of that approach, of course, is that policy is made by a small group of people behind closed doors, and the model has been challenged for that very reason. In terms of federal-provincial relationships, I think an important example of pushback to that type of policymaking was in terms of the efforts to amend the Constitution in the 80s and 90s. Meech Lake Accord was largely rejected and was criticized as being a closed doors, elite bargaining diplomatic approach. Meech Lake proposed a different model of policymaking, which certainly not perfect, was more inclusive. In a sense, it strikes me that strong mayor powers for certain cities may actually recreate this type of diplomatic relationship, but on a very unequal playing field between provincial and municipal governments. So provincial municipal diplomacy, for example, we could see a situation where a small number of people, a group of elites, are deciding policy behind closed doors for a small number of people. And I think that this context, this is concerning for two reasons. First, like I said, the city is in a very unequal and uneven position with respect to the province. I've done a small amount of work on local autonomy in Canada with Zach Spicer. And in that work, we conceptualized local autonomy as the ability of local governments to do what they want to do free from provincial constraints. Of course, that definition is open to debate, but that's how we defined it. To the extent that the mayor does have additional powers here, it is entirely on the terms of the province. This may change policy, it may lead to some necessary changes, but to me, that's not enhanced autonomy if it has to be in line with provincial autonomy, provincial priorities. Mayors can request that something potentially be made a provincial priority, but the province has the power to say no. My second concern is around legitimacy and equity. So a number of years ago, John Tory expressed interest in strong mayor powers after a request from the City of Toronto Chief of Police for increased funding for additional surveillance. Tory said that if he had strong mayor powers, he would give the chief of police, he could just give the chief of police what he wanted. But per Matt's chart, council voted in support of Tory's position anyway, so that wasn't necessary. It was only a few hours of debate. But this type of a situation where the chief of police, for example, could ask the mayor for something, we could potentially see a situation where possibly 3 people are making policy for 3 million people. And when it comes to issues like policing, but also transit, housing, and homelessness, there's potential for inequitable consequences for policy that is being made in that particular way. So debate within council, but also broader participation of Indigenous-led groups, of Black Lives Matter, of others would be benefit here, I think, benefit to the development of equitable and responsive policy. My second point relates to housing. I do always feel the need to make a note of the fact that the current housing crisis, of course, is deep and it's wide, but it is relatively recent. There has been a crisis of low-income housing in Canada for decades, for over a century. For all but a brief period of time in the 1960s and 1970s, there has been pretty widespread disinterest in meeting the housing needs of people with low incomes. While municipalities certainly share in some of the blame for the current housing crisis, including the lack of supply and a lack of gentle density, the housing crisis is complex and it requires the participation of everyone, especially when it comes to deeply affordable housing, rent geared to income housing, intensively supportive housing. Municipalities cannot do this on their own. This is particularly the case in Toronto and in other Ontario municipalities, where there is an acute need for housing, but also a severe mismatch of authority and resources that's not seen in any other Canadian province. Ontario was the only province in Canada to download housing responsibility to municipalities in the 1990s, but it did so without also transferring additional funding. This means that intergovernmental alignment in Ontario is extremely important because the government that has authority for housing does not have the resources that it needs to create an inclusive housing system, including a housing system that has deeply affordable housing. So municipalities certainly do have a role, but I have to say that I find it so frustrating that Ford says that housing is such a priority of his, and yet has done so little with the powers and the resources that he and his government do have. And resources, of course, means, a lot of money that could be transferred to protect housing, to build housing, to create supportive housing. But also the Task Force on Affordable Housing suggested that the province of Ontario itself ban inclusionary zoning across the province. This isn't going to solve the entire housing crisis, of course, but it could help with the missing middle. Ford is not willing to do this. Instead, he's asking mayors to do what he himself is not willing to do. He says it's a priority, but he's asking mayors to invest their own political capital and take the political heat for changes that are necessary but controversial. If we have, I will have an opportunity to talk a little bit more about housing policy in BC, which I think creates an interesting contrast in terms of how the province is providing leadership, but is also presenting itself as a genuine partner and collaborator with municipalities, not just on creating space for the private sector to produce more types of homes, but to create what the Union of BC Municipalities calls right supply, the type of supply that would be more deeply affordable or affordable. So I'll talk about that a little bit later. That's it for now. Thank you.
Thanks, Allison. Gabe?
Thank you. Thanks, Zach. Thanks not only to Zach, but also to Enid and the rest of the panel for this chance to talk about strong or stronger mayors. I've been asked to focus my remarks on the executive dimension of stronger mayor powers, meaning how mayors in Ottawa and Toronto will oversee the administrative functions of government rather than the mayor's legislative powers, vetoes and such. I know you said everyone was talking about vetoes. I want to talk about executive powers, if you don't mind. In this respect, I would say that I surprised myself a little bit here. I'm rather positive on these changes. Before I explain that, though, let me first just state on the record that the manner in which the provincial government dropped these changes on Toronto and Ottawa, a surprise from on high in the middle of an election, once again, is completely inexcusable. I'm not here to defend that decision. In my opinion, that is indefensible. For the moment, though, I'm going to set that aside and come along on this journey with me. Set that aside and focus instead on the substance of two specific reforms that are proposed in this legislation that I do think have some merit. So first is that the mayor of Toronto and Ottawa now have a statutory responsibility to lead the municipal budget process. And second, that mayors now have the power to hire and fire the most senior members of the civil service, with several notable exceptions listed here on the slide, as well as the power to reorganize the machinery of municipal government. So up here on the slide here, you see what these changes look like in both the legislation and the regulation. Let's start with the budget. This seems like a small change on the face of it, the responsibility to prepare the city budget, but it actually flips the current budget process on its head. Most people assume that politicians, not public servants, present budgets, and including city budgets. After all, that's what we see in federal and provincial government. After weeks of months in consultation, pre-budget consultations, the Minister of Finance stands up in the legislature, presents the government priorities, Parliament votes, and the public service gets on with the business of implementation. If you ask me, that's how it should work at the local level, but it doesn't. In municipal government, particularly in Ontario, it's almost the reverse. And Matt has had to sit through lots of this in his day. Formal budget process begins with a presentation by the city manager or the chief financial officer, treasurer, what have you, who tables a staff recommended budget, sometimes called a draft budget or a preliminary budget. And if we're getting technical, it's actually two budgets, as Zach knows, operating and capital, but that's besides the point. Where is this budget tabled? In Toronto, it's tabled first at the budget committee, which notably is made up of city councillors, not the mayor, and Ottawa to various standing committees. These committees then pick apart all of these staff recommendations, teasing out what they like, what they don't, etc. Then it's the public's turn. That's when we see people come down to City Hall to yell at the budget committee about all the ways that the staff budget is wrong. Then, to show that they've listened to the people, the city councillors on that committee start tinkering, move a few $1 million here to another program over there. A program that might have been targeted for cuts gets revived at the last minute, that kind of thing. Finally, the budget, with all these small changes, makes it to the full city council, where after lots of bluster and bravado, a very little substance really, the budget is generally passed with almost no meaningful changes to the original document proposed by staff. Consider that the 2022 Toronto operating budget was passed almost exactly the way the city manager drew it up, even though it came with a $1.4 billion shortfall on a hope and a prayer that other levels of government would pick up the tab. Turns out we're still roughly $800 million short. So who's to blame for all this? Well, everyone and no one, all at the same time. It's a system defined by ambiguity and plausible deniability. Staff get to say they're just following council's direction because only council formally can direct staff to make changes to the budget. Councillors get to say that they're following staff's expert advice. And the mayor gets to say, well, he gets to take his pick. He can either say he's following the best recommendations of staff or the will of council. In short, no one right now owns the budget, not councillors, not staff, and certainly not the mayor. And that's not right. The buck should stop somewhere, and I think it's perfectly reasonable to expect that the mayor should wear this responsibility and formally lead the budget process. Let's remember that the mayors of Toronto and Ottawa, not just Mayor Tory and Mayor Watson, but any mayor of these cities, past, present, or future, is the only person elected to office in these cities, not by 5,000 or 10,000 voters in a single ward, but by hundreds of thousands of people across the city. No matter what your personal opinion of Mayor Tory, the fact is in 2018, he directly received at a minimum nearly 20 times more votes than each of his council colleagues, and in some cases, more than 85 times more votes. Voters elect mayors to lead their city government, so I say make them lead. Of course, I'm not advocating that the mayor and only the mayor should have complete control over every aspect of the budget. Council still has an important role to play here to debate and approve that budget, a responsibility, as you see here on the slide, that the new legislation does not change. The only formal power that the mayor actually gains in this process is, as my friend Brian Kelsey, who my collaborator on the City Hall Task Force, as Brian likes to say, this is about the power to propose. Why is this important? For three reasons. One, it would give clarity to the civil service, to staff, about how to plan and deliver services consistent with citywide priorities and commitments laid out by the mayor. Two, it would send a signal to councillors that the priorities of the city writ large take precedence, and priorities including housing, for example, take precedence over strictly local matters. And third, it would match the public's expectations that the job of the mayor is to lead and that they should be held accountable, for their decisions. That leads me to the second key piece of the story here, control over the machinery of government. Here, once again, the reality of municipal government in Canada, and particularly in Ontario, conflicts with people's general understanding of how things work. Our current laws in Ontario designate mayors as the chief executive officers, the CEOs of their cities, which sounds nice, but it comes with no actual power to act like a CEO until now. Now the mayor can hire or fire top civil servants and otherwise reorganize the structure of local government. Now, if you're cringing at the thought of the mayor having such unilateral power to hire and fire the most senior civil servants, I will remind you that this is precisely how things work at the federal and provincial orders of government. Who appoints and dismisses the clerk of the Privy Council, the secretary of cabinet, every federal and provincial deputy minister? Well, the prime minister, the premier, of course. The chief executives, for lack of a better term, of their respective governments. In principle, this would be no different. And again, on the whole, I think that's a good thing, because as it stands today, the lines of accountability between the city manager, their executive team, and the mayor are not as clear as they should be. The public service currently serves all of council equally. In practice, that means that public servants are pulled in multiple contradictory directions. Making senior staff more responsive to the mayor's priorities as chief executive would, in my opinion, rebalance the policy process to prioritize citywide concerns over the often parochial concerns of local councillors. Does that mean that the mayor should have the power to dive deep into the bureaucracy and hire and fire anyone they please? No, of course not. And that's not really what's being proposed here. The regulations proposed, as on the screen here, clarify that the power to hire and fire is limited to, quote, the highest level of senior management. Now, with all that said, do I think more can be done to protect the independence, say, of the civil service? Absolutely. Whether that means drafting new codes of conduct, amending the public service bylaw, even legislative changes at the provincial level that bring those protections in line with what applies to the provincial and federal civil service. These are all ideas I think that deserve consideration. Hopefully there's time to discuss that in the Q&A. In principle, though, I would say that overall the changes to the mayor's executive powers specifically have some merit and could help bring about more effective, responsive, and accountable local government. So I'll leave it there for now.
Thanks a lot, Gabe. Well, this is quite an interesting and eclectic response in some ways. I mean, we hear from Karen that this sort of bears a family resemblance to American practice, but differs from it in some ways is antithetical to what's going on in the United States and the direction that things are going in the United States. From Matt, we hear that at least in terms of the relationship between mayor and council, it may have very little effect in practical terms, at least in Toronto, not speaking for all cities where this could go into operation. Allison has highlighted a very important dynamic, which is the exclusive potential for a very exclusive form of elite bargaining between a mayor and provincial or federal executives. And also this dynamic of that this may, with the focus on housing as a justification for the act, the Strong Mayors Building Homes Act, that this represents perhaps a downloading of political responsibility for housing in a way that absolves the province of taking ownership of this issue. And then from Gabe, we have a a somewhat favorable reading of it in terms of its ability to clarify accountability in terms of the interface between politicians and the administration. So I think we have an opportunity to probe this a little bit further. I'd like to throw some questions to my colleagues at the table here. Karen, one thing to think about, and maybe this sort of shades into what Allison talked about as well, is the horizontal intergovernmental relationships, the relationships between a strong mayor and other mayors of cities in the region, in greater Toronto or the greater Golden Horseshoe or whatever we want to call it. Will this change, in your opinion, the nature of the mayor's ability to lead the region or broker consensus in the region?
Yeah, thank you for the question, because I didn't get a chance to talk about the US history of regionalism. And this is a place where I, like Gabe, am optimistic. In the US, where regionalism is most effective, it's when the mayors sit around a table and work out issues together. And this can happen in councils of government, which are regional bodies that are where the mayors are represented. This can happen in metropolitan planning organizations, but you need to have a mayor at the table to drive regionalism. You can't have a council manager form of government where you don't know if the promises are going to be able to come through, right? You don't know who truly represents the city. So in that sense, there's that. This could be a building block for regionalism in Southern Ontario.
So the ability of the mayor to be able to make credible commitments on the part of the municipality. Though that starts to feel like, making this sort of bargaining the province in a different word, different meaning than province, but it makes it something that's quite exclusive and something that only the executives get to share in, which was something that you spoke out against, Allison. Do you want to sort of react to that perspective?
I mean, I can understand the purpose of having somebody come together and sort of make decisions. Of course, when it comes to housing and homelessness, that's a regional issue, and you do need to have some type of coordination and communication between different regions. In Vancouver, for example, it's very fragmented, and so it can be very difficult. It's been an issue with policing as well. There's other ways, though, of again, other ways of sort of sharing information. The Metro Vancouver regional Greater Vancouver Regional District, homelessness can be whatever. They've put together sort of this large metro council to discuss homelessness, and they sort of collectively decide what to do with federal funding. So I think there are other models of information sharing. I understand like having the sort of the mayor being able to speak for mayoral issues, but when there are some complex policies that do involve not just the municipality, it can be helpful to have different voices. And then it's not necessarily just the mayor of Surrey talking to the mayor of Vancouver, but you have the shelters involved, you have service providers.
Thank you. One question behind this, and this could go maybe to Gabe, maybe to Karen. Do you think that a strong mayor having this hiring and firing power will make it easier to recruit high quality administrators, or do you think they'll be worried about the political relationship in the mayor and of becoming politicized? Gabe, why don't you start? Okay.
Karen, you mentioned Bloomberg administration and often touted as forgot my microphone. The Bloomberg administration often touted as a home for many creative and innovative civil servants. I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, I think, and this insight comes from Richard Florida when we were at the Board of Trade panel a couple of weeks ago, and creative class, right? He's all about talent, and he said, well, we'll get more talented candidates for mayor, and we'll get more talented staff. And there are examples now. They may again be the exception, not the rule, because often the civil service and independence produces more professionalism. But those exceptions are really powerful. So you have the Bloomberg administration and the sustainability plan for New York City and Jeanette Sadik-Khan and a number of other super talented department heads that made that happen. So there is that potential.
Gabe, did you want to weigh in? Or?
Yeah, just to say that I don't think it's any different. So if we're talking about centralizing the executive powers of the mayor, it's no different than questions of whether you can attract the most innovative and brightest folks to go into federal or provincial governments, where you have a clear center that can implement things. So in this case, you're just setting up the conditions for that, but it's no guarantee.
All right. Matt, one thing that occurred to me while you were talking, right, is, there's the potential for the veto to operate symbolically, right, rather than in actual effect. Like the vetoes don't actually have to happen, right, in order for them to be used as a threat or as a way to kind of bring people into line. Do you think that dynamic might be possible? Maybe not in Toronto. I know that Toronto is your area of expertise, but if we could imagine maybe a smaller municipality, that this effect might work differently.
Yeah, I think it could. I mean, one of the things that this legislation does is it, makes official things that are already kind of happening by convention in a lot of cases. But, whenever a mayor gets new powers, I'm thinking specifically of the City of Toronto Act that gave the mayor more power to appoint the chairs of committee. And that has been at times something that the mayor has been able to use to ensure loyalty on certain issues. John Tory is not somebody who likes conflict, I think is fair to say. But I mean, there was a point with one councillor who he had named one of his deputy mayors, who then went and endorsed Doug Ford for mayor and was removed from that position. So, there is that potential for the mayor to look at these powers and say, okay, I want to ensure some degree of loyalty among councillors, and maybe not actively using the veto, but talking about using the veto or suggesting using the veto could be a way to do that. But again, like you sort of have to balance it. I think the mayor's already spent a lot of time thinking about building consensus and thinking about ways to potentially compromise to get that strong result on council, where it's not like a nail biter of a vote, but shows a real strong support for what the mayor wants to do. And I don't really see that changing particularly. So it becomes like a balancing act of like, okay, we have these tools the mayor can use to engender loyalty, but at the same time, if the mayor starts using those threats too often, then you have the risk of going too far with it and making an enemy of a councillor. So I think it'll be interesting to watch that dynamic play out. Like you say, there'll be the case in Toronto, but I am also very, very interested to see, how this works in Ottawa and potentially what likely other municipalities as well, where there isn't the same level of media scrutiny on the dynamics of council. So I think the effects there could be more pronounced, and we just may not know about them.
And you do raise a really interesting idiosyncrasy of the way things work in the City of Toronto. Under the City of Toronto Act, the mayor appoints an executive committee made up of the chairs of the standing committee, right? And that's not true in every municipality across the province. That gives the mayor already an incredible agenda setting power. And one of the questions that I continue to be preoccupied about with all this is, in a smaller place, I don't know, Woodstock, where how would a strong mayor in Woodstock's council play itself out? Oh, okay, Gabe?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this one, and I don't have a good answer to that, but more to raise questions along those lines, right? So I was pretty forceful in my remarks on executive powers with regard to Toronto and Ottawa, but I would be much more cautious thinking about how that would play out in the 442 other municipalities in Ontario. Partly because, part of my argument there was the legitimacy argument, the legitimacy card that the mayor receives so many hundreds of thousands of votes compared to city councillors. Well, not all municipalities, in fact, close to 60% of municipalities in Ontario do not have a ward-based system. They have councillors elected at large. And so that covers off that kind of argument. If you have councillors that are also elected at large, they are thinking about the citywide concern, just the nature of that system. Also, there is a population threshold that you might want to think about, and that often goes hand in hand with the ward-based system. Add to that the peculiarities of Ontario's municipal governance system with our regional governments and our two-tier system of governments. What does it mean to give, does this mean that not just mayors get extra powers and strong powers, but the regional chairs, some of whom I would remind the audience are not currently elected? That's peculiar and strange, and I'm sorry for the folks in the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing that are sorting through all of these different scenarios right now, because it does get a little bit messy. So just to kind of blunt my previous remarks on this question of how it would work elsewhere, it's anyone's guess right now. It really is a lot trickier question to answer than specifically for Toronto and Ottawa.
Another aspect that I think has flown under the radar is that just returning to the veto issue, right, which is such a hot button issue. I think it's good that we smoke it out fully. We've talked about how the veto can only be exercised when it has something to do with a provincial priority, right? And provincial priorities are very vaguely worded. So what potential might we see, and I throw this to everybody, for a mayor to kind of use that strategically to attach any number of different issues to a provincial priority in order to get their way. Another aspect, if you don't want to go for that question, is that what we effectively have as part of the veto is what Americans would call a line item veto on the budget, right? That the mayor can veto any council passed bylaw to do with the budget. So let's say council votes to increase spending on something that the mayor doesn't want to spend money on. The mayor can veto that bylaw, and then we have the opportunity for a 2/3 vote to override that. How will that play out? You've certainly, Matt, you've observed a great many budget meetings where, let's give $20 million to that. Let's give $20,000 to that. And the mayor probably would have loved to have had a line item veto to kind of discipline the sort of nickel and diming that can occur.
Yeah, I'm so interested to see how the next budget process plays out, because every budget process I've covered has basically followed the same script, and this one will be radically different. I think, like Gabe said, there is a good thing in that right now, basically, when the budget comes along, everybody gets to sort of say, not it. Staff get to say it's the mayor or it's council and the mayor get to say it's staff. This way, it's going to all come down on the shoulders of the mayor. So I'm very interested to see where that plays out. I will say, Gabe talked about how this was dropped in the middle of an election, and that is a big regret with these budget powers, because what I would love to see is during elections like this, the expectation that candidates for mayor actually provide a budget for, the budget that they would pass if they were elected. And to do that, you would need a bit more from staff. Like a lot of stuff tends to shut down during campaign periods. Like we haven't had a budget variance report since April. No reason why we couldn't have had one that came out in September or whatever that provides some better numbers on what to expect for next year. And then you could say to all the candidates, like, it's not enough for you to just talk about what you want to do. Like, let's see a fully costed budget. I think the candidates will not love this idea. So I'm really interested, how can we as a city and, the media, but also, people in this room and academics sort of push to make that the reality. And I think it could have been the reality for this election if we had a bit more time to sort of understand what was coming. So I think that's, could be a really nice benefit for people, because right now we're in this weird situation where we get candidates who talk about all the stuff they're going to do, but then get elected and say, oh, okay, like I got to figure out how to make this fit in the budget. And there's no reason why you need to be elected to put numbers to things. It's all public information. You know, I go through it all the time. So they can do the same thing. But so I think that could be a really nice benefit, but we got to make it happen.
You wanted to weigh in, Gabe?
Just to add that, you know, we're in our Toronto bubble here, but there are other elections happening elsewhere, including in Ottawa, which this legislation is pertinent for. And in that election, a couple of the front runners in that election have put out a very clear list of their budget priorities, including costing, whether you believe the numbers or not. Most of it is based on public accounts. And you're right, in the Toronto election, people are talking in the abstract about all kinds of things without any clear sense of how much it would cost. And that's across the board, at least at the two debates that I've seen. So perhaps this would discipline that process a little bit.
So related to that, you know, we're talking about the mayor having maybe an expanded role in intergovernmental relations, both with province, with other municipalities, the mayor taking more of an agenda setting role vis-a-vis council and so on. You know, it's been said that Ontario mayors do not have a lot of capacity within their own offices to do things. They rely very much on staff. Would we need to have a more elaborate political function within the mayor's office to manage these expanded relationships and processes?
That's me.
Anybody?
I'm really interested to see how this relationship with staff and the mayor plays out, just because the city actually, I think, has done a good job of recruiting, like, you know, renowned talent for key positions. And we've seen sort of the rise of like the superstar head of the department in Toronto. Jennifer Keesmaat was well known as a city planner, and also, you know, went against Tory on a couple of key things when she served in that role.
And afterwards.
Yeah, for sure. You know, and I think the mayor can take this in different ways, right? Like there's this idea where the mayor's office can say, we want to have the best of the best. We want to have people who really are capable, or they can start with, okay, here are our positions and priorities, and we will hire to fit that. And that, I think, would be a loss. Whereas, you know, the first, where you'd say, okay, like we really want to bring in really good people and empower them, that could be a gain. So it could go in very different ways depending on the approach that that takes. I do think it would be prudent for the mayor to really look at the structure of their own office in terms of, okay, like we're going to have more responsibility now. The mayor's office is very much like a lot of comms stuff right now and less like administrative executive stuff. So if it's going to be a real CEO's office, then like let's staff it like a CEO's office. But politically, there could be some blowback if suddenly the mayor's office is like, we need to double our budget next year. But I would just sort of say, you know, get through that and you'll probably be better off.
So Karen, as an observer of, you know, American municipalities, including San Francisco up close in your former backyard, like what kind of capacity did you see in, say, Gavin Newsom's office in San Francisco?
Yeah, I was just thinking as Matt was talking about this staff based on comms, and what would happen in San Francisco or New York or Los Angeles is the mayor would appoint a czar. The US, I don't know, that's maybe a Russian, you know,
we do czars, you know.
Okay.
Not at the municipal level.
Yeah, no, and they're czars in the municipal level and at every level. And the czar, you know, and here you could just see, you know, that the new mayor-elect would look at the provincial priorities and say, well, I need a housing czar and an infrastructure czar. And that's a little concerning, because if you look at the way, for instance, that the housing priority is written, there is no mention of affordability. So that housing czar is likely to be a condo developer, right? And then infrastructure czar, is that going to be someone who builds highways or, you know, subways rather than surface transit? You know, so it's really concerning, as opposed to the old system where we had the wards and we had, DC 37. So you had, people like Mike Layton making sure that some of that money went to affordable housing and that sort of thing. So some of those, if they're not voiced as priorities, could go by the wayside.
This opens up a very important institutional difference, right? In these American strong mayor cities, most of them, the mayor does not sit as part of the council and does not vote on council business. The executive branch, like the president, is separate from the legislative branch, like Congress. And so the way that the executive branch is financed is very different, right? I mean, in this stronger mayor system where the mayor is the same mayor as before, one vote on council, but with extra prerogatives. What if the mayor on the first meeting comes in and said, okay, if I'm going to staff out properly my office, I need an extra $5 million. Can we authorize that in a mid-budget amendment or in our first budget? What do you think would happen?
I think we'd be moving more towards what we see in federal provincial, and there are critics of the centralization there, but you're quite right to identify that there is a hard divide in the mayor council system, right, between the executive and the legislative branch. And here, maybe this is our Canadianness here showing through, where in our parliamentary system at other orders, right, we have a nested executive nested within the legislature. Not to get too professorial here and everything and theoretical, but the point here being is that we are through, again, my focus was on the executive side of things. We are identifying the contours of the executive branch of municipal government, which right now, just to be clear in legislation, is completely blank, other than saying the mayor is the chief executive. We have nothing else to go on right now. So this provides at least some boundaries of what that means, of one member of council with a little bit more executive authority, not to that effect of what we see in the American strong mayor systems. And I think that would suggest that you might have more of those budget requests to increase the capacity of the mayor's office, or to, well, it doesn't have to be in that language so political in nature. It could be to create new departments that are headed by very accomplished and experienced and expert people. I think of, I was looking at the mayor of Boston recently, and she was announcing that they were hiring a massive hiring spree on, what would they call it? The streets cabinet. So if you're someone that cares a lot about road safety and Vision Zero, I know Matt is very interested in that, reading his newsletter, and I am too. My helmet's underneath there, which I was going to use for the Q&A in case anyone lobbed anything. But there's opportunities there to expand resources, not just within the mayor's office, but through the civil service in a very targeted way to achieve those citywide objectives of, in this case, for instance, redesigning streets. So I think maybe it's a middle ground that is evolving here. That's in a quintessentially Canadian way, a blend of British and American institutional features.
Yeah, and of course, in places like Boston and New York, we have great examples in recent years of mayors forming like almost their own little software startup companies within the mayor's office to develop apps for the city, and doing hackathons and hiring Silicon Valley professionals to do things unilaterally, right? And it's always been unclear to me where that money comes from, right? Is the council appropriating that money, or does the mayor sort of get a big pot up front that they can allocate as they wish? These are questions that we'll have to ask in this kind of thing. I do want to move to audience questions, of course, for the rest of our time. But Allison, I wanted to give you time. You brought up the idea of British Columbia as an alternative model of the way housing is talked about, and wanted to give you a chance to circle back to that.
Great, thanks. So there's sort of the question about whether or not strong mayors building homes will address the affordability crisis, not just in Toronto, but certainly it is very acute in Toronto. And I think that as it currently stands now, I think there's a lot of room for improvement. And my frustration here is more at the provincial level. And I think looking at BC, not just current day BC, but also historic BC, and also going back into Ontario's history as well, there are there are some lessons. I think that if housing is a priority for the province, then there's room for the province to show leadership or at least genuine partnership with power sharing, political capital, but of course, money is so important for the housing crisis, especially for affordable housing. David Eby's plan in BC is, I think, a really interesting contrast. Housing is a priority for him. He's of course not currently leader of the NDP and not premier, but by all accounts, he will be elected sort of leader of the NDP and therefore premier. And the housing plan that he's put out is really interesting. It does rely very heavily on municipalities, and it is asking a lot of municipalities. In some cases, it is imposing new requirements on municipalities, but doing so in a way that is putting him as premier front and center, and he's taking that political heat. He has also prioritized affordable housing. So the UBC municipalities, the Union of BC Municipalities has endorsed the plan. They do have some concerns, but like I was saying earlier, they do note that it has a priority not just on homes, but on the right type of housing. This includes $500 million to purchase at-risk rental housing to really lock that in and to make sure that it won't be converted, allowing for the right of first refusal to municipalities and to nonprofits to purchase that with provincial funding, using public land to create affordable housing, a flipping tax that is not totally defined, but does have some sense of the longer you own the home, the less tax you'll pay. But secondary suites would be legal all across the province, 3 units on every lot is what he's proposing. So that's what sort of the Affordable Housing Task Force in Ontario was proposing for Ford to do. He's asking municipalities to make housing plans, and if they're not ambitious enough, the province will set targets, but if they exceed those ambitions, then the province is providing incentives and sort of rewards. I always find that a little interesting. Provide the incentive up front so that municipalities can really get going, as opposed to on the other side of things. But municipalities that are creating more of the gentle density, the province is providing that funding, as opposed to proposing to cut developer charges, which are used for parks or for service centers. The province is proposing to invest in that. So I think this is interesting in the context of Victoria, where there was a plan. The mayor and her allies were proposing to eliminate single family zoned parts of the city. Throughout the process of debating and deliberating that, it became clear that council was split 5-4 and that it would have been defeated on council. So they decided to postpone it to after this current election, allowing for a fresh vote of people, a fresh sort of council. But I think actually, fingers crossed, hoping that Eby would put that in place for them, taking the heat off of the city and sort of putting it on the municipal shoulders. So that's something that I think that the premier could do. And this is what I'm talking about in terms of sort of leadership and going out in front of things. This is not just the NDP. Gordon Campbell, back in the early 2000s, the BC Liberal leader, which is much closer to the Ontario PCs than BC NDP, worked with Sam Sullivan of the Nonpartisan Association, very much to the center right of the political spectrum in Vancouver, to also purchase vulnerable housing in the downtown east side and throughout Vancouver to protect it from conversion, to partner with municipalities to use city-owned land and nonprofit expertise to develop supportive housing. That was not just sort of the new left-wing premier coming in. This is housing, and deeply affordable housing, supportive housing is not a partisan issue. The final example in the 1960s, when Ontario provincially was actually the Canadian leader in housing policy, even during this period where the Quiet Revolution was happening in Quebec and Quebec was expanding the welfare state, it was Ontario that was driving housing policy change provincially, created the first housing corporation. All the other provinces followed suit. There was opposition to family social housing. There continues to be opposition to family social housing. In Greg Sutter's book, which is the seminal text on social housing history in Canada called Still Renovating, he recalls that Robarts was asked why he didn't back down in the face of this pressure. And Robarts, the progressive conservative premier of Ontario, said, sometimes you have to do the right thing. So there was also, I think, some, willingness to kind of override local opposition or including neighborhood groups. But I think that these are examples of how, if housing is a priority, if an inclusive housing system is something that is, is of interest, there's a lot of precedent historically from right of center or left of center governments for what the province can actually do to not just shove municipalities into the ring and then wait for them to do all of that groundwork, but to actually partner in a meaningful way, put money on the table, create incentives, and work collaboratively in a way that creates different types of housing for different types of people quite effectively. Certainly not enough, as the housing crisis in Vancouver and Victoria is if not more acute than it is in Toronto. But I think these are different examples of, if housing is a priority of the province, then, there's a different way to sort of show to what extent it is the priority.
Thanks, Allison. So we do have about 20 minutes left, and I think we should shift to audience questions. We do have people online and here, so I want to make sure we reach both groups. I think we'll start with our group in the room. We have a microphone there, so it's in the back there. The microphone will come to you, and then all the people online will be able to hear you.
I'll stand to make it easier to hear me. Can everyone hear me? Cool. I'm Helen. Thank you to everyone in today's panel and U of T, my alma mater, actually. I guess I came here as an urbanist, someone who's kept tabs on City Hall, but also Queen's Park, and is deeply concerned about this supposed strong mayor legislation, because I'm not a fan of this provincial government. Doug Ford, I think, has done a lot to reduce the autonomy of Toronto, and I still resent him for cutting city council in half. So this change, I think, attaches more strings from Doug Ford to John Tory.
So do you have a question for the panel?
I do have a question.
Okay.
Is there any room for optimism given it doesn't look great? I mean, I appreciate everyone's take from their various research interests, but at the same time, it's just like, is there room, for optimism? Could this be a good thing?
I mean, one thing I wonder, just rhetorically, and perhaps our group can respond to this, is if we were to wind back a decade and a Liberal government introduced this while David Miller was mayor, what would the response be? Anyway, does anyone want to take up the audience member's point?
Yeah, I do think, the provincial priority stuff is really where I see the major pitfalls with this legislation. A lot of the actual strong mayor stuff is, a reorganization. A lot of it is making official stuff that happens by convention, and that's fine. But we're talking about a strong mayor bill, but it doesn't necessarily lead to a strong city, because the city is basically being told, here are your marching orders in terms of provincial priorities, and you have to deliver on them. So that, I think, is the part of this that I just can't wrap my head around. If that wasn't there and it would be more of just an organization of municipal powers, that would be, I think, a more positive thing. So if a future provincial government could come along and say, we're getting rid of the provincial priority stuff, cities can set their own priorities, that would be, I think, a positive step. The other thing that I struggle with is just, if I were to make a list of things that would lead to more housing and more affordable housing in our municipalities, I'd have to get pretty far down that list before I would say, oh, we got to, have strong mayor powers. That's not, there's so many things above that. And you really have to start with the money, right? Like there's the big barrier to affordable housing, especially in our current interest rate environment, is just going to come down to dollars and cents. So if the province is serious about this, then, show us the money.
I think maybe we'll alternate with online questions. Cass, do we have one? I don't know, Cass, if you don't have a microphone, you could run over to this one.
A couple of online questions.
Why don't we alternate?
Okay. This is from Teru Ikeda. I believe the Ford government will have more power to influence City Hall with the strong mayor legislation. This act was passed to focus around housing issues. However, how might this legislative change impact policing in the city? The recent Auditor General report showed police response times fell way short of target.
Okay, so how will this affect policing in the city? Does anyone want to bring any insight to that?
Only from an institutional perspective here in terms of rearranging the chairs. Just to highlight on the slide, I guess that you are no longer seeing, but for some reason still projected to us. When I was going through the executive changes in terms of the power to hire and fire, one of the exempted positions is the chief of police. So that's just one thing to clarify. However, my understanding is the mayor and already has substantial control over the appointments to the police board, the police services board. And so this would consolidate some of that power in terms of setting from the outset, I believe, and I'm looking at Matt here because he can verify this as well, but this would, I guess, streamline that process to select a chair of the police board more directly than what is currently in place. But as Matt has been alluding to, these are the the whispers that happen that the mayor already has substantial control over selecting the chair of the police services board. So this just kind of formalizes that. What that impact might be on policing, I'm not in a position to say, but just to clarify exactly what's being laid out here. It's not my area.
And we might add that there's nothing keeping a future provincial government from making crime and policing a provincial priority, which would open that whole sphere of subject matter up to the veto and these other things that are tied to the provincial priority. Now, we had a question in the front here. We could get the microphone over. Sorry, she was first.
Well, firstly, thank you very much for the education. We're all trying to bone up on this subject as much as possible. My name is Nikki Ward. I'm running for City Council in Toronto Centre, Ward 13, where we have an enormous amount of intensification. So I'm extremely interested in how this plays out should I get elected. Obviously, there's a couple of things around the role of city councillor in Toronto, particularly, that are unique in that we are given huge areas to administer as councillors, 110,000 people, city the size of Boulder, Colorado, for example. And I'm immediately off to a ward boundary discussion here, so apologies for breaking out of here. One thing I think that may be a cause for limited optimism is that while the city of Toronto has theoretically been amalgamated, it still operates as various little fiefdoms or fiefdoms. Multi-tenant housing is a good example of something that is allowed in Toronto, but with a license, allowed in the former city of York, but not licensed, and not allowed at all in East York, North York, or Scarborough. And multi-tenant housing doesn't have to be bottom of the barrel. That is, can be by definition, affordable housing. So I guess my question to the panel as a whole is maybe to comment on how this might positively or at best neutrally affect amalgamation of the city of Toronto, which theoretically happened 20 years ago, but we're still waiting to happen. Is that broad enough?
Anyone want to jump in on that?
The rooming house vote are multi-tenant houses, AKA rooming houses. Multi-tenant houses is a far better term for them, but people know them as rooming houses. I mean, that was a big, probably the only real loss for John Tory over this term. He wanted to legalize them citywide. His suburban councillors pushed back against that. Tory ultimately didn't even bring it to a vote. And that is a case where, I mean, the mayor would still need a majority on council to pass those changes to the bylaw. I mean, he can't really veto a a vote that won't happen. So it's a case where, you know, theoretically, some of these powers could lead to, you know, him taking a stronger hand in trying to get that majority. So that could be cause for optimism, though I caution that because, I mean, he's had, you know, he could have threatened to, for example, remove committee chairs who weren't ready to support that issue. And as far as I know, he did not. So he had options and wasn't prepared to take them. So I really think that's what this comes down to is, you know, you can provide a mayor with stronger powers, but is that person going to be prepared to use those powers to make change? Because there's always going to be some blowback to, you know, wielding those powers. So, I mean, it'll be interesting to see. Am I super optimistic about it? Not super optimistic, but I'm curious. Let's say that.
And good point, Matt, that, you know, the veto only comes into play if a bylaw is passed in the first place, right? So, Allison, we have very little time left. I want to make sure we get a couple more questions in, but
the only other
please.
thing that I was going to say, and I'll credit Karen with this for this comment that I read in the Star or the Globe, is that that's not new homes. That's not new. The construction of new homes. So is that something that is sort of vetoable is maybe a question.
Interesting. I think what we should do, you had another question queued up from the online group, and then maybe we'll collect that one and yours, and then we'll try to synthesize it all before we have to leave today.
The next online question is from Catherine Oliver. Do you think that the strong mayor changes will make it more likely that incumbent mayors will be re-elected?
Okay, and then let's collect these questions.
Oh, I thought it was me too. Okay, why don't we do it together, right? Well, I just
sing a
wanted to
duet,
say,
yeah.
like, we talked a lot about Toronto, and now it's moving to all cities in Ontario. And there's like, you know, there's Hamilton, there's Mississauga, and Brampton. These are cities 500, 600, 700,000 people. How's a strong mayor going to affect their situation? And these are the places where we want to build a lot of these 1.5 million houses that we're trying to get. So yeah, we talk a lot about Toronto, but in these other places, I think it's going to have a profoundly different effect. Here in Toronto, not so much, but anyway. That's my question.
So we did have a hand over here, and we also have your hand. Let's collect all these up and hope we have time to answer. Yeah.
Jeff Cattell, Leaside and Fontra and stuff like that. I attended the former mayor's event last week, and was very struck by the uniform response of the former mayors against the legislation for all the reasons that we've talked about today, including the disempowerment of other councillors. And Mayor Crombie at the end, he made an interesting point. He said, this legislation is permissive. It's not mandatory, it's permissive. So the first meeting of council, there can be a vote to accept or not accept this legislation. And he said, you know, audience, go out there, gather your residents and, you know, I guess wait for the election on next Monday, but get them upset about this thing and get them to contact the new councillor or the returning councillor and get them to bring forward a motion at the first meeting of council in opposition to this legislation. I'm just wondering, where do you stand on that question? First of all, is it permissive or is it mandatory? And secondly, what would be would you tell people to go out there and contact your councillor?
Thank you. And let's just collect the one more question over here.
Thank you. I was actually wanting to go back to the question that Zach was starting to frame around the definition of provincial priorities and the acknowledgement that they can be vague, but also if we actually look at the wording of the act, the veto is if, in the opinion of the mayor, there is a potential violation of provincial priorities, which seems to create a ridiculously much larger latitude for discussion. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. So we have 3 questions on the table. Will the incumbency of the mayor be reinforced by this? What about other cities? The permissiveness of it and the expansiveness of provincial priorities. So I open it to our group here to jump in on any one of those questions.
Well, I just have an opinion on one, which is the incumbent mayor, excuse me, question. And I do believe that what we've seen in the US is that the strong mayor gets reelected because they've managed to assemble a machine that gets them reelected. So
How much does that depend on there being parties, though?
well,
Which we don't have and
but
can't
you have ideologies
yeah,
and alignment around ideologies.
ideologies
So,
can't raise money.
yeah.
Anybody else on any of these
Just-
issues?
I have comments on two. The incumbency, not with any empirical evidence to back this up, but I think the premise of some of my comments on the executive side is to, again, my focus was on accountability, which is in the hope that it might reduce incumbency, right? So if people are more aware of who is actually making the decision, then there might be more of a push to actually hold those people accountable in an electoral process. That's one way to do that. So that's my idea there, but I wouldn't be able to back it up. And I think the party aspect complicates the American comparison there. On the permissive or mandatory, yes, I think this is kind of a permissive framework. And I think a smart mayor, and I'm not naming names here, but wherever this applies, a wise mayor would use that to his or her advantage to make sure that local councillors do feel empowered. So you don't create this kind of very antagonistic relationship. And, just to go back to the first comments of tonight, an optimistic way, a hopeful way of looking at that, and we've talked about in the past with our work on the City Hall Task Force, is that a mayor could, again, remember I was talking about the importance of highlighting and emphasizing citywide priorities versus local concerns, the power to create committees, appoint chairs, etc. There is room here to design a committee structure and then delegate some of the authority that's currently at council to allow and empower a more local committee, whether that's community councils in their current form or otherwise, where the mayor through the budget process would set the citywide agenda, but actually empower local councillors to respond to local community members through those other forums and get those type of issues off of the main council agenda. So Matt can actually enjoy his 3 days council meetings and move those off the council agenda, and those local matters that the local councillors care a lot about, that the local constituents care a lot about, could be determined in a different forum. And the mayor has that power now. I think that's a permissive power that this allows, that the mayor can move in that direction. And I think a smart mayor would go that direction as well.
One of the interesting things we're seeing in the media are mayoral candidates in Ottawa, in Barrie, which isn't even affected by this yet, in other places, saying that they will not use these powers even if they're given to them, right? Including the two leading candidates for mayor in Ottawa. So it's on the agenda, right? And mayoral candidates are putting it there. In Toronto, we're seeing something a little bit different with it either being welcomed or not being welcomed and then welcomed again. Well, this is, so the question is, what are we seeing in Brampton and Mississauga, where we have mayors who are and in Hamilton. So I think this is something that the people in other cities need to pay close attention to. I haven't seen the candidates where I live now in London, Ontario, city of 400,000 people, quite a sophisticated bureaucracy. I haven't seen them make any claims one way or the other.
From what I recall, the Ontario Big City Mayors Caucus has come out against it, but keep in mind, this is election season, right?
Yeah.
So we'll see if their tune changes after election.
On the question of permissive versus whatever the other side of that was, I do think the legislation allows for the mayor to delegate a lot of these powers back to council. I expect that we'll see a motion from a member of council requesting that Tory or whoever wins the election do that when council meets after the election. I have a pretty good idea of which councillor we might expect it to come from. See if you can guess too. will that pass? I don't know. I think it will be an opportunity for constituents to get out there and, state how they feel about it. But I also am really hopeful, or what I would like to see is, we need to have some extra guardrails on top of this new structure. As an easy example, I think based on the legislation, the mayor could propose a budget, and that would include the budget for the accountability offices. And there wouldn't be like a set. So you could theoretically like reduce the under general budget to like $1 a year or something like that. And, you have to really think about the stuff around the fringes like that and come up with ways to make sure that, transparency and accountability are built into this. And that is especially true when you get outside of Toronto and look at some of these other municipalities, because again, like the level of scrutiny that we have here, which isn't great, but we still have like a press gallery at City Hall. That's not true in a lot of other places. So that's what I am really hoping to see.
I think that's a great way to end. We have hit 6 o'clock. I think it's time for Enid to close us out. Thank you.
I'm the only one who gets to stand up here. We always like to end on time. And those of you who used to come to our events, when we had events, we always do like to end on time. I think at one point, Zach referred to the panel as an eclectic panel. But actually, I think it was a pretty balanced discussion of the issues around this strong mayor legislation. I've certainly learned a lot. We've had some optimism, some pessimism, but mostly a lot of questions and suggestions for more work that needs to be done, particularly on some of these accountability measures. I asked a mayor from another part of Canada who isn't a mayor any longer what he thought of the strong mayor system, and he said, well, we're talking about a strong mayor in a weak system. Why aren't we talking about the weak system, in the sense that local governments have very few powers to raise revenues, for example, something I'm very interested in. So there's certainly much more out there that we could talk about. So I just want to thank everyone on the panel, Karen, Matt, Gabe, Allison, and of course, Zach, for walking us through all of this today. Today's event has been recorded and it will be available on our website in the weeks to come. And as I mentioned, Zach is writing a paper that's going to somehow make some sense out of all of this. And we will put that on our website as well. So please share all of this with your colleagues who weren't here today. And thank you for coming and have a wonderful evening.